Caesar arrived a few minutes later, walking in briskly. So much correspondence, he said. I apologize for being late. He looked around. I hope you have not been bored. This room is quite bare. He indicated the empty table. I have had an opportunity to think, I assured him. I was bursting to tell him about Octavian, but I had given him my word. Here in this adjoining room, he said, steering me into it, is the sanctuary of Mars. Here is the sacred shield that Numa, the second king of Rome, received from heaven. It foretells Roman victory. It was dim in the room despite the bright light outside. An oversized bronze statue of Mars stood on its pedestal, and all around the walls of the room gleamed many shields. To keep it from being stolen, Numa had 11 copies made. No one knows which is the true one, and here are the spears, which foretell our doom by vibrating. Do you feel them shiver? What do they tell you about Spain? He reached out and grasped one. Nothing, it is quiet. So you have these things in your safekeeping, I asked. They are to be guarded by the Pontifex Maximus, but they belonged to a king. The Regia was the seat of the kings, Rex Regia. The Pontifex Maximus inherited the priestly powers of the kings. It did not die with them. Neither apparently did the idea of kingship. I have never heard so much talk about kings until I came to Rome. I paused. So you are descended from kings and exercise a kingly guardianship. You have little way to go until you are forced to accept the title itself. He chose not to answer. Instead, he said, "It may amuse you to know that I am served by a priesthood of women, the Vestal Virgins. In their shrine is the Palladium, the wooden statue of Pallas that fell from the sky at Troy and was brought here by Aeneas. Would you like to see it?" "If you would like to show me," I said. I could tell from his tone that he would not take kindly to Octavian's antics in the shadow of Aeneas, as it were. Perhaps there was a glimmer of something sacred that he had honored. After all, Octavian had known that, and I had not. The new calendar was announced, and immediately the extra days were introduced. People lived the same day over, which gave rise to some peculiar behavior. Some strove to repeat everything exactly the same way, but do it better. Others decided one of the days did not count. Then the people who had to grumble over everything, like Cicero, made snide remarks. When someone mentioned that the constellation Lyra was due to rise, Cicero sneered, "Yes, by edict." The new war in Spain was likewise announced and caused alarm and wonder. Were the civil wars never to end? A mood of despair seemed to seize people, made worse by the earlier sunsets and growing chill. The blue-skied triumphs and all they had promised seemed to wilt, killed by this early frost. Rains fell, dreary days bringing shivering mornings. We had to light braziers in the villa and close the shutters. I was surprised to find what a downward pull the dullness and drizzle had on my spirits. And at the same time, I wondered how much of my usual optimism and energy derived from the bright, dancing climate of Alexandria. I had always thought it natural-born rather than influenced by the light and air around me. I saw little of Caesar. He was engrossed in his hurried war preparations and in pushing his reforms through the Senate. He had so little time. Sometimes, if I were in the forum, I would glimpse him hurrying from his residence to his new buildings. At a distance, I could always recognize him by his posture. I could also tell when he saw me by the way he hesitated for just a moment, but he never came over or altered his route. I dreaded his going. The only good thing would be that once he went, he must soon return, must return, must return. I wished that I could send him off with news that I was to bear another child, but it was not like Egypt, where we lived together day and night. Here we were so seldom together, and the whole feeling of Rome was different from the bursting fertility of Egypt. I did not conceive, as if the gods of Rome had shut up my womb. They did not care for me. I could feel it. The hard, stony gods of Rome were not like Isis, queen of heaven, she who had both passion and compassion. Caesar would embark at the end of the 3rd November, a speedy preparation even for him. He would take his veteran 5th and 10th legions with him, order 2 other veteran legions to join him, and raise the others later. He had unfortunately disbanded some of his famous legions after the last wars, and they were now busy farming on the land they had been awarded at their retirement. He announced to Rome that he was taking his great-nephew Octavian to give him first-hand training in warfare. Well, perhaps it would fill out his spindly little arms. I thought to myself that his surreptitious reading of the war correspondence should stand Octavian in good stead. He would then appear to Caesar to be miraculously well informed on the subject, but such had doubtless been his aim. Spring had come in March. The yellow wildflowers all along the Tiber burst into bloom, and in our own gardens the trees unfurled their tentative green leaves. Ptolemy's cough melted away once the weather became warmer, and as if to make up for it, he grew taller quickly. But there was still no word of the outcome in Spain. It seemed like a mockery to luxuriate in the warm spring breezes and stroll in the twilights when the future of Rome hung in the balance. The Roman festivals of Lupercalia, Anna Perenna, and Liberalia passed, and it was not until the 20th day of April that the word reached Rome, causing an explosion of celebration in the streets. Caesar had won. On March 17th, he had at last succeeded in drawing the rebel forces into one decisive battle at Munda. It was a desperate fight, one of the bloodiest in Roman history, when it was over 30,000 erstwhile followers of Pompey lay dead on the battlefield against only 1,000 Caesarians. Labienus was dead. So was Gnaeus Pompey. Sextus, the younger Pompey brother, had escaped. The thing that turned the battle, this was recounted in wonder on the streets, and I heard it told many times, 10 times for every 10 city blocks. Since the sides were almost evenly matched and it was growing dark, and the Caesarians began to grow disheartened and fell back, was Caesar himself forcing his way into the front lines where the breach was. He ripped off his helmet and shouted, "Do you mean to deliver your commander into the hands of these boys?" And he began fighting desperately hand to hand, and at the sight of that his men rallied and the battle turned. I must trust to myself to find the solution, he had said, and he had done so, with a foolhardy, wild gamble that had his name and his alone written all over it. I was weak in hearing about it. His courage was something unhuman, and so was his luck. It was immediately declared that April 21st, the day after the news was received in Rome, would be celebrated forever with chariot races in the circus. Then the Senate outdid itself in an effort to confer honors on Caesar. Caesar should have the title of imperator for life, and the title should be made hereditary. He must be consul for 10 years. All the anniversaries of his previous victories should henceforth be celebrated with annual sacrifices. He could wear the laurel wreath at all times and the garb of the triumphator at all official occasions. His statue must be set in the temple of Quirinus with the inscription, "To the Invincible God." At public games, an ivory statue of him must be carried in a litter, and a chariot follow with its trappings, in company with the statues of other gods. Another statue of him must be set up beside the statues of former kings of Rome. A temple dedicated to the liberty Caesar had brought must be built at public expense, and at his return, a thanksgiving of 50 days should be ordered. I was hungry to see him, in spite of my earlier contention that I must return to Egypt as soon as the seas opened. Good reports from Alexandria now permitted me to stay longer in Rome. How could all the crowd see him return and crown him victor of the world, and Caesarion and I not welcome him home, to his city and to us? But when was he to return? No one seemed to know. He lingered in Spain, settling administrative problems there and making appointments. Octavian had joined him in his headquarters. Others rushed to meet him in nearer Gaul, which he would pass through on his way home. Brutus Antony Decimus. At last it came, a personal letter to me. It had been written from Hispalis. I thanked the messenger and gave him some token, doubtless too much, and then waited until I could shut the door of my room and read it in private. It is over, and I am victorious. I know you have heard this already, but what you have not heard I now tell you. I have often fought for victory, but at the Battle of Munda I fought for my life. I was spared. I returned to you and to Rome, alive and restored. My love to you and our son. I fought for my life. What had I been doing that day? Why had I not felt it? It seemed impossible that it could have been an ordinary day for me. Without meaning to, I crumpled the precious letter by holding it too tightly. It took him a very long time to return. He was not back at the anniversary of his first triumph, when the Romans duly paraded out his statue in company with that of victory and the victory games. He did not set foot in the city until the heat had begun to wane. He even retired to his private estate at Lavicum for a week or so beforehand. There he rewrote his will, but no one knew that until long afterward. There were murmurs that Caesar would celebrate a triumph, but it seemed unlikely that he would allow this to take place since his enemies had been other Romans. Triumphs were only to be celebrated over foreign foes. And then he swept into Rome, bringing this speculation to an end. He had returned. He was victorious. He would order all things anew. The suspension of events would end. He did not send any messages to me or invite me to attend any of the private events welcoming him. Yet I knew he was waiting, and as was I. All things in time. The night he came to the villa was a rainy, chilly one. Yes, the year was turning again. I heard the crunch of the gravel under his horse's hooves and knew someone was approaching outside. I did not think it was he. I had no specific day. I was awaiting him. It was enough that I knew he would come. I heard his voice, heard him dismissing the servants. Then I heard him taking the stairs 2 at a time, bounding up them to my door. I flung it open, found myself staring into his face in the dim light. It seemed forever, it seemed only an instant ago that I had seen him. I was overcome with the impact of it and buried my face in his shoulder. I had no words for the joy I felt in having him with me. He touched the back of my neck gently and drew my head back so he could look at me. A faint smile was on his face, one I had never seen before. Then he kissed me, a deep kiss that spoke of the pain of our separation. "Let us get out of the doorway," I finally said. We had remained at the threshold where anyone could see us. I drew him inside. He stood a little changed. He looked thinner. His face had more of the eagle in it, leaner and more acute. "Thanks be to all the gods," I said. "Fortune has not deserted you." "No," he said. His voice was softer, more tempered. "The sacrifices just before the Battle of Munda foretold disaster, but I ignored them. I said all would be well because I wished it to be." I shuddered. Fortune was merciful to her favorite son. After such arrogance, perhaps she likes it. He came over to me and embraced me. "Do you?" "It is part of you," I said, "and I love everything about you." "Is that true?" he said. "Then you are different from all the others." Against what I held to be all common sense, Caesar was bent on having a triumph to celebrate his victory. He would claim the war had been a Spanish rebellion and aided by traitorous Romans. This would fool no one, as I pointed out. He said he did not care. There are those who hold that Caesar during those days was not behaving rationally, that his usual clear-sightedness, his sterling trait, was clouded and his judgment suspect. My interpretation is that he was exhausted, increasingly embittered by the failure of his reconciliation policy and the automatic suspicion and hostility of the aristocrats toward his every gesture. And in too great a hurry, he treated the Senate and people of Rome like a pitched battle that must be fought without delay on the spot. Politics and war are not the same. His genius on the field did not transfer to the byways of the government. By vanquishing all his foes and being appointed dictator, he had been given an unspoken mandate to reorder the government, as Sulla had been. But hope was that he would somehow restore the republic, the pious words on everyone's tongue. But the truth was that the cherished republic had grown moribund. Even today, I wonder what could have been done to restore it, save going backward in time to an era when it worked. The Republic was a private club, like my Egyptian club, the Society of Imhotep. When I was a child, it answered the needs of only a few aristocrats while excluding vast numbers of men with equally powerful interests. It was the second group with whom Caesar cast his lot, going over the heads of the old established order. He could not hand the reins of the government back to the rigid old group, and that was what restoring the public meant. The Spanish triumph was held, against my advice and that of Cicero, Brutus, Cassius, Lepidus, Decimus, and even some said Balbus and Appius. It was an unusually warm day in early October, and once again the streets were swept, garlands were strung on the monuments, and buildings viewing stands were set up. Caesar rode forth in glory as he had the year before, followed by solemn Octavian in his chariot. But in the midst of all the cheering and adulation, One of the tribunes of the people refused to rise from his bench as the triumphal chariot passed by. I was shocked when, instead of gazing serenely ahead, Caesar pulled his horses to a stop and glared at the offending tribune. In a harsh voice, he shouted, "So, Pontius Aquila, why don't you make me give up the state? After all, you are a tribune." Aquila, astounded, just stared back, but he did not rise. The triumphal chariot resumed its journey, but the incident burned its way into common memory. The banquet afterward was said to have fallen short of Caesar's expectations, or was it the people's? And so he ordered a second one a few days later. Then he affronted public opinion further when he allowed his two less than competent lieutenant generals, Pettius and Fabius, to celebrate their own triumphs, even though it was their inability to make headway against the enemy that had called Caesar to Spain to begin with. At the same time, he abruptly resigned his consulship and appointed Fabius and another man to fill out his 3 months of the year, his last 3 months of the year. "Whatever can you be thinking of?" I asked him one afternoon when he had come to the villa, one rare afternoon when he had a spare moment. "They keep accusing me of being a tyrant," he said. "Does a tyrant resign his offices?" "Why must you be so angry?" I asked. "Were you angry at Gnaeus Pompey or at Vercingetorix? Had you been, could you have defeated them? So now you give me advice, you whose one experience of war was a stalemate between your forces and your brothers, you whose one experience of an upheaval in government made you lose your throne and have to flee." He fairly spat the words. I refused to rise to this bait. "I admit as much," I said. "But I was only 21 years old, and it was my first experience of ruling or of fighting. You, the most seasoned soldier in the world, should know better. And now you are an expert," he said. "How old are you?" 24, as well you know," I said, "and I have had the advantage of being a bystander in this tug of war." Bystanders can sometimes see things others closer do not, and what I see is a man acting as if he has been attacked by a pack of wolves, a man striking out in all directions spitefully. "Has it really been necessary for you to say sarcastically at the end of every political promise since the triumph, 'providing Aquila allows me to'? It sounds like something a village woman would say at a well about her rival. It is not worthy of you." He shook his head and sank down on a chair. "I suppose not," he finally said. "It is petty and petulant," he frowned, "but they drive me past endurance." I laughed. "Past endurance? You who have existed on roots and snow, who have traveled under excruciating conditions. How many miles did you cover a day en route to Spain in the winter?" "Over 50, he said, then a boyish smile. "And I composed a long poem on the way. I didn't let a minute go to waste. It's called The Journey." "Yes, and you have yet to let me read it," I half scolded him. "But as I was saying, how can you now let these political barbs drive you to distraction when all that nature has thrown against you cannot do it? People are more maddening than cold, starvation, thirst, or heat. You have come too far, done too much, to fail now because of human weakness. Repair this weakness. Do not let it gain control of you." Would he listen to me? "It will bring you down, negate everything you have worked for." "Am I not a human being?" he cried, a howl of anguish. How can I order myself to be a stone? These things rip at me, they tear at my very fabric. Mend it and rest, I said. Your spirit is wounded and you must let it heal. As you would a cut of any other sort on your body, I fear. I said slowly, that if you do not, it will become infected. Indeed, it is on the verge of it. Perhaps he did as I said. He seemed to disappear for several days, but the unrest and murmurs continued. For a city at peace and unthreatened by external enemies, Rome seemed singularly nervous. I was startled when, near the end of the month, Octavian was announced at the villa. I met with him in a chamber opening off the atrium. It was painted in a deep red with mythic scenes to compensate for its having only one window. He looked taller, older. Had he had higher sandals fashioned? His delicate beauty had been tempered, and the body under the toga seemed more substantial, sturdier. The Spanish campaign had turned him into a man, after all, though he had seen no actual fighting. Just fighting his way there had been enough. You have grown imposing, I said. Your journey must have had salutary effect upon you. I was surprised at my own warm feelings for him. He had grown on me, and his loyalty to Caesar had been proved. That counted for a great deal. I come to bid you farewell, he said. My uncle has arranged for Agrippa and me to depart for Apollonia across the Adriatic and receive further training in both rhetoric and warfare. I know it is difficult for him to send you away, I said, meaning it. We will join him on his next campaign, when we can be of more use to him, said Octavian. Next campaign, there was to be another. Parthia, I asked softly. It had to be Parthia. Yes, we will already be halfway there. He will send for us after he has crossed over. When? Next spring, then? I said knowingly. I believe so, he said. I wish you and Agrippa a safe journey, I said. No more shipwrecks. And I hope your training is everything you desire. I looked at him, at his pure incandescent features, his wide-set eyes, his light tousled hair. All I thought at the time was, Caesar's family is a handsome one. I have benefited from knowing you, I added. And I from knowing you, he said, his pleasant smile in place. And that, I swear, was my last meeting with him. The last words we ever spoke face to face. How the gods like to mock us. I sift that meeting time and again, as if some portentous words might flutter out of my memory, but there were none. Nothing but a cordial farewell between two people who loved Caesar well and would have died for him. The streets were jammed. My litter could scarcely make headway. The jostling and pushing meant that the litter rode as roughly as if we had been at sea, and indeed, that was where we were, attempting to tack through a heaving sea of people. This is fun, said Ptolemy, peering out the side. His voice was weak with the return of the cold weather. His cough and debility had come back. I wish I had not yielded to Caesar and stayed on so long. Now we were trapped until spring. I longed for the wide streets of Alexandria, where the thoroughfares were never choked like this. We stared out to visit the quarters of the silver and goldsmiths, because Ptolemy wished to watch them at work. He had decided artistic bent, especially for design. The arrangements had been made days in advance. They were expecting us at their workshops, and here we were, stuck en route. What was causing this? I glared out of the litter, as if I could shrivel up the culprit with my gaze. All I saw was a vast throng of heads and shoulders, and I caught sight of an outsized statue lurching along an open wagon secured by ropes. Behind it, a little way away, came another. I did not recognize them. "Look," cried Ptolemy, pointing, "it's Caesar over there on those steps." I turned to see. Indeed, Caesar and some others were standing on the steps of the Theater of Pompeii and its attached buildings, bigger than the theater itself. "That way," I commanded the bearers, and they turned abruptly and made their way across the road. What a grandiose building this was, I thought. It looked almost as though it belonged in Alexandria. Caesar watched us approaching and came over to us. "So this draws even you?" he asked, bending down and peering in at us. "No," I said, "we happen to be here by accident. What is it?" "Why, it is the day of the restoration of the statues," he said. "Come and watch." When he saw my reluctance, he said, "Wherever you were going, you cannot get there. You might as well join us." He held out his hand and helped us out. He did not let go of mine as he returned to his spot on the stairs. "What a day, eh?" said a man I recognized as Lepidus, after a moment of memory searching. "Who would have thought they'd return?" "Out of storage," said another man. "Mark Antony. Get the cobwebs off them. They'll be as good as new." "Yes, never throw anything away," said the woman standing beside him. It was Fulvia, his new wife. "That's what I always say." "It couldn't be about household things," said Lepidus, "for all the world knows you aren't concerned about those." Fulvia did not look amused. "I'm amused. I manage well enough," she said finally. "I have not heard Antony complaining." She looked to him to agree. No, he said, "nothing to complain about." He turned to me. "In Egypt you celebrate the resurrection of the dead," he said. "This is the first time it has happened in Rome. The statues of the vanquished and the forbidden are rising once again on their pedestals." An extraordinarily large one was approaching, swaying on its cart, steadied by workers. Two tired-looking oxen, their horns down, plodded toward the theater, drawing the load. "It's Pompey," said Caesar to me. "Do you recognize his moon-like face?" "Yes," I said, "although it has been many years." Thank the gods I had not seen him at the end, as Caesar had. I paused. "Why are you bringing his statue back?" "His statues," Caesar corrected me. "All over the city they are being put back, along with Sulla's." "But why?" It seemed very odd to me. "To show that the upheavals and civil wars of Rome are over," Caesar said. "Now our heroes can be appreciated for their deeds, their bravery or ingenuity, without reference to the particular party they belong to. All that is past." "So you wish," said Fulvia sharply, "but it will take more than just putting old statues back on their bases to make things right." I looked carefully at her then. She was classically lovely, but her fierceness of expression made me think of Athena with her war helmet on. She looked like a woman, but her words and manner were something else again. "You just want a lot of other statues to keep you company," said Antony to Caesar. "So many of yours are going up, you don't want them to be lonely." "Oh, honestly, Antony," Fulvia glared at him. "Sometimes you sound like a fool." "Shut up, my love," said Antony lightly. "Let's see, there are to be 2 on the rostra and 1 in each temple in Rome. as well as one in each city in the country and the provinces. It's a good thing they can all be copied from one model, or else you'd get tired of posing, dear Caesar. A ruler should never get tired of posing, said Fulvia. In some countries, it's their main occupation. What about Egypt? She shot the question at me like a challenge. What was wrong with her? She seemed itching for a fight, but as a queen, I would not give her the satisfaction. Perhaps you have not seen the statue of Cleopatra I put in the temple of my ancestors, said Caesar quietly. I suggest you do so. It will answer your questions. Fulvia scowled and walked toward the cart. On the pretext of inspecting the statue of Pompey, which the workmen were wrapping in a sheet and binding to a wooden platform. Prior to lifting it out and carrying it into the building, Lepidus burst into laughter and clapped his hand over his mouth. But Antony roared, and as if he cared not if everyone in the vicinity heard him, it was a laugh of pure delight, such as I had seldom heard from an adult. Usually that unbridled happiness dies with our childhood. Hush, said Caesar, the fierce one will hear you. Then all three of the men howled like little boys. Caesar dropped my hand and clutched his sides. He laughed until tears came from the corners of his eyes. What's so funny? Asked Ptolemy, puzzled. He looked around curiously. Something Roman men find amusing, I said. Wives. A vendor carrying a basket of sausages and bread was wending his way through the crowd, crying out to advertise his wares. Let's buy the whole basket, said Antony, waving his arms. Over here, he jumped up and down. The man hitched up his tunic and climbed up the stairs expectantly. He had a pet monkey perched on his shoulder. You'll find these are the best, he said. Sausage from Lucania. Bread baked this morning of fine semilla. We'll take the whole lot of it, said Antony. Oh, and your monkey too. The man was taken aback, but she's not for sale. Antony looked disappointed. Then we'll forego the sale, you see. It's the monkey we really wanted. But sir, she's a favorite of my children. However, if perhaps... He looked dismal. Could you not take the basket instead? No, what use do I have for a basket? Antony was stern. It's the monkey or nothing. Well, very well if you must. He reached to take her off his shoulder and very slowly handed her to Antony, who encircled her with one of his muscular forearms. Wonderful. Fulvia has long had a recipe for monkey brains, he said gleefully. The man went white, and Antony could not continue. Gently he handed the monkey back. It was a jest, he said. Keep your monkey. I have no need of one, he laughed. After all, if a man has children, what does he need a monkey for? They look the same and behave the same too, but we will buy all your sausages, good sir. After the man had left, clutching his monkey, Lepidus loaded his hands with the bread and sausages and tasted one. Strong, he said. Rather much basil and way too much garlic. I suspect it must be hiding something. Why didn't you at least sample one before buying them all? Antony, munching on a sausage, shrugged. Too much trouble, he said. Besides, I plan to give most of them away. He yelled out at the crowd standing on the steps. Here, free sausages and bread. Help yourselves, courtesy of Marcus Antonius, consul-elect, bridegroom suspect. Caesar started laughing again. Hush, or Fulvia will beat you, and I will cancel the appointment. Along with all those other new appointments you have made, Antony turned toward me as to a confidant. Caesar has increased the number of senators from 600 to nearly 900. Downright barbarians, some of them, imported from Gaul, sure to cause comment. No one will notice me. I'm much too ordinary. These were the men who helped me to victory. If it had been pirates and cutthroats, they would have their reward. They too would have their reward, said Caesar. At least they were my friends and loyal to me. But they wear trousers, said Lepidus. Trousers instead of togas. Trousers in the Senate house? The end of the world has come. That's absurd, said Caesar. Here they will put on togas, regardless of what they wear at home. The men heaving the statue up the steps were groaning, and I could see the figure sliding slightly on its platform. But they were almost to the top. Come, said Antony, you don't plan to watch it being put on its pedestal. Let's go have some fun. I know a place. Caesar gave a mock moan. No plays, no chariot races. I know, said Antony. Let's go to the athletic field and have a race, as we used to. Do you remember? He leaned over and put his arm around Caesar's shoulder. Yes, I remember, said Caesar. I wonder if I can still beat you. Come and see, said Antony. Come and see, but I warn you. Laughing, they descended the steps together, Caesar walking lightly. I will always remember that day on the steps. It consoles me when I think the world is a sorrowful place. Joy sticks in the memory, bright and burnished, leaping out across the years. It is a thing pure in itself, joy, and the rarest of traits among men. So you'll have multiple wives, I said. Even Jupiter did not, even though you're to be addressed as Julius Jupiter. That won't be enough. That would limit you to one, Calpurnia, your Juno. It was the first time I had been alone with Caesar since the new year, and I found the proposal to permit him several wives was still causing me to bubble with anger. There is no such proposal, he said coldly, neither to call me Jupiter Julius, nor to allow me more than one wife. O ye gods, my enemies spread the most outlandish lies about me. He held his arms up toward the heavens, then turned stern eyes upon me. And that you believed it, that you would think such a thing of me. I can expect little from my enemies, but that you, yes, your what? Let him answer that. My love, my soulmate, my other self, but not your wife. You have Calpurnia. He turned aside. This is tiresome. For you, perhaps. For me, I would like to know one thing. Why do you stay married to her? Do you love her? To divorce her would give scandal. Scandal has never deterred you. To invite Gauls and Libertini into the Senate gives scandal. How your Latin is improving, he said sarcastically. Answer me. I married Calpurnia 14 years ago, he said. Her life with me has been one of absences, of separations. Now I am reaping honors. Should she not be allowed to share in them as a reward for all the privations? He sounded so reasonable, so persuasive, as if I were a demanding, selfish shrew. You are a queen with a country bulging with riches. You do not need any of the honors that are coming to me, but she, without me, she is nothing. She has suffered from being my wife, living in the midst of those in Rome who hated me. Is not some reward her due? Would I not seem the most callous of wretches to cast her off now? No one else would ever take her as she's barren. He was an eloquent pleader. No wonder he was known in Rome as second only to Cicero in his oratory. How noble, how self-sacrificing you are, I finally said. There is a place for us, he said, I promise. It is different, grander, more enduring. But you never reveal what it is. Soon, he said, soon. The plan is almost ready, and in the meantime, the outsized honors heap up. The Senate spends its hours deliberating what may come next. Let's see, what was it last week? You are to be called Pater Patriae, father of your country. Yes, your Latin is definitely improving. Don't interrupt. Besides that, your image is to be put on coins, and your birth month has finally been renamed Julius, July. I paused. Oh yes, and you will sit on a gilded chair in the Senate and wear the garb of kings formerly wore. He turned away as if a little embarrassed. Don't be shy, I taunted him. There are other honors, pray tell me, don't hold back. I could see now that I had truly angered him. I will not be mocked, he said. Nay, tell me. I tried to sound more gentle. I would know, and I would know what they mean. They have proposed that all my decrees, past and present, be future, be binding. Future, how can they know what they will be? They cannot, he said, and that is what makes it such a staggering privilege and responsibility. He paused. Besides that, my person is to be sacrosanct. When next the Senate meets, they will vow to defend my life. So I will, to show my good faith, dismiss my bodyguards. Is that not foolish? They are a nuisance, said Caesar. This gives me a good pretext for getting rid of them. They have also decided that there must be a college of priests attached to the temple to my clemency. They will be the Luperci Julii. All this is grown monstrous. It seemed alien to the Romans. Suddenly he laughed, and I shall appoint Antony my chief priest. I was taken aback. Are you trying to show your disdain for their honors? Will you not insult them and move them to fury? Anger I can stomach, he said. It is silent hostility and plotting that I cannot counter. He took both my hands in his and looked at me searchingly. I can answer your anger about Calpurnia, he said. What I could not endure is your enmity, your grudge. He kissed me tentatively. I do not have that, do I? I could not live if I did. He was persuasive. He was compelling. He was overwhelming, as usual. I could not prevail against him in either my anger or my warnings. Would he had not been so compelling, he might have lived. We had been closeted in his private workroom. His Spanish bodyguards, soon to be dismissed, he had said, were outside and in the main atrium. I have an appointment, he said, glancing out the window to see where the sun was. I must be at the Julian Forum at the 9th hour to meet some senators. He sounded wary. They requested it. Come with me. I hardly think they would wish me to be present. Is not the forum a public place? They are the ones who requested that we meet there, instead of in the Senate House. He grabbed his toga and began putting it on impatiently. At least walk there with me. Have you seen your statue since I put the pearl earrings on her? No, I said. It is always so crowded in there, with so many people looking, that I do not frequent it. Still, I shall walk with you. Good. He swung a cloak over his shoulder in case the weather should turn nasty. Together we left the house. A contingent of the guards followed us, marching briskly. I had to admit that gray skies and leafless trees became the forum. The travertine stone, the marble, all varying shades of gray or pearly white, seemed enhanced by having a frame of the same color. Even our breaths, as we walked, made little clouds of the same opal white. The newer stone of the Julian Forum made it seem illuminated. It was so much brighter than anything around it. The building had been completed, and now the mounted statue of Caesar was in place before the temple, as was a fountain running very slowly now in the cold. Caesar paced around, waiting, his feet making quick, impatient steps. No one was approaching, and he began to grow cross. Then he saw them, a group of 10 or so magistrates walking slowly toward him, their togas lifting in the wind. I will go inside, I said, leaving him. I climbed the steps up to the temple and stood in the shadows of a column watching. I saw Caesar sit down and take out a letter and begin to read it, not looking up until they were quite near. Then he seemed to greet them pleasantly enough. There was a great deal of bowing, of flourishes, of speeches, and then finally something was presented to him. He took it and unrolled it, then smiled and extended his hand. The men milled about, doing a sort of slow-motion dance around Caesar's bench. But he was still sitting. Why did he not rise? I could tell by the expressions of the men and by the way they moved back that they had heard something they did not like. They fawned some more before taking their leave, walking in single file across the courtyard and out into the forum. Caesar sat watching them go, then he closed his eyes and seemed to be clenching his jaw. I waited until I was sure the men would not return. Then I stole over to Caesar, who was still sitting on the bench, his face drained of all color and his whole body rigid. Wordlessly, he thrust the scroll into my hand. I unrolled it and read the words, "Dictator for life." The rest in tiny Latin words I could not decipher. "What is this?" I asked. But he gave no answer, and when I saw his face, I understood what had happened. "Can you walk home?" I asked him. "You can lean on me. We will go slowly." He had felt an impending attack of his illness and had been forced to dissemble before the senators. He stood up stiffly under the masking cloak, put his arm around my shoulders. Together we traversed the short distance across the forum back to his home. I was thankful that the cold weather meant the usual throng of businessmen, vendors, and shoppers was missing. As soon as we were back inside his house, he tumbled onto his bed and shut his eyes. "I think it will pass. I do not think it will develop further," he said through gritted teeth. I wet the hem of my gown. It was in his washing bowl, used it to wipe his brow. I must confess I felt a certain triumphant relief that Calpurnia was not there. He remained motionless on the bed for what seemed almost an hour. Then he turned over and sighed. "I think it is safe now. It is going." I thought you said you had conquered the illness. I have. I do not let it get control. His voice was still weak. In Spain, it was the same once, just before a battle, but I never fall anymore. No, because you sit down first, I said with a smile. You witness what it used to be. Sitting down was not a cure. He carefully sat up. There, the room is still, my limbs obey, and I never lost consciousness. He sounded very relieved. The men, what was all that about? It was then that he revealed just how ill momentarily he had been. He had to reach for the scroll and read it before he could answer. The Senate has made me dictator for life, he said haltingly, each word being led forth like a sacrificial animal. This is impossible. Obviously, he had no clear recollection of exactly what the men had said when they presented it. Any restrictions they had mentioned. He shook his head. A dictator is appointed for a temporary term only. A dictator is an office outside the regular offices of state. Consul, praetor, censor, tribune. It is not a normal part of the government because the dictator's power supersedes all those other offices. Dictator for life, that's another word for king. For what is a king but a dictator for life? He was thinking out loud. This cannot be. But I pointed to the scroll. There it is in writing. It must be a trick. Was I meant to refuse it? Perhaps that was what it was. He shook his head again, but I do not remember what I said. You did not refuse it, of that I am sure. How do you know? The men looked displeased. Perhaps you did not accept it with enough pleasure. Pleasure was not what I was feeling. Dizziness and stiffness was. But they do not know that, I reminded him. Here, I put some pillows behind him so that he could lean back comfortably. Tomorrow, when you are fully recovered, you will have to attend the Senate. Thank them profusely for the great honor. That is, if you intend to accept it. You always could refuse it. You know, I dangled the decision before him. You could say that you wrestled with your conscience all night and realized for the good of Rome you must decline it. But the truth is, for the good of Rome, I must accept it. His voice was stronger now, but quiet. It is for my own good that I should refuse it. You have never yet refused anything that fate has awarded you, I said. That is the essence of your character. The next day, all of Rome was buzzing about the unspeakable arrogance and insolence of Caesar in refusing to rise when the senators came to him with this great honor. They castigated him for overweening pride, and since only the truth about his illness would have exonerated him, and he refused to divulge it, he had to bear the full weight of the accusations. One other way lay open to him to decline the honor, but as I had known, had he been able to do that, he would not have been Caesar. The next incident happened when he was returning from a ceremony outside the city. A throng of bystanders hailed him as king. I wondered then, and I still wonder, were they planted there by his enemies in hopes of deluding Caesar, making him believe there was a popular movement to make him king? He replied, I am not king but Caesar. Then all Rome buzzed about that. It was not long until an invisible hand placed a diadem on Caesar's statue on the rostra, and one of the tribunes of the people had it removed. Caesar ordered the diadem to be dedicated to Jupiter, Rome's only ruler. Still Rome buzzed. Under whose orders were these things taking place? Caesar's enemies, or were they true indications of popular sentiment? I had an idea for taking the initiative out of the invisible hands, which I knew were not Caesar's. Let Caesar stage a show of his own to proclaim his intentions. I called a secret meeting at my villa at night to discuss it and bade not only Caesar, but Lepidus and Antony to come. Antony was necessary to the plot, as he was indeed now the priest of the Julian Luperci, as Caesar had joked or threatened earlier, and Antony as consul would have a part in a certain ceremony due to be enacted soon. Lepidus was Caesar's master of the horse, the second in command to a dictator, and I knew he was loyal to Caesar. Beyond Antony and Lepidus, I could not be sure of anyone else. February 15th, the day of the Lupercalia, was clear and frosty. It was cold in the villa, but I knew that across the Tiber in the Roman streets the body heat of the crowds would more than offset it. People had been readying themselves for this wild festival for days, and long before dawn they lined the streets, warming their hands before smoking heaps of coals, stuffing their mouths with cheese and goat meat from the food stalls, and singing off tune with the street musicians. I had no intention of setting out before late morning. I knew that the ceremony of sacrificing the goat and dog, symbols of Pan and Lupercus, would not be over until then, and the priests with their bloody strips would not issue forth earlier. But Ptolemy and I were carried into the forum in good time, and we took our places on the steps of the temple of Saturn overlooking the rostra, along with the dignitaries of Rome who were permitted into the temple's precincts, a guarded area because the state treasury was kept there. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw some of the very people we had discussed earlier. Returned exiled members of Pompey's party, senators that I recognized but could not name, and others I knew like Brutus and the two Casca brothers, Trebonius and Tullius Cimber. I smiled and nodded at Decimus and his cousin Brutus, standing a little lower down. Below us, the forum was a knotted sea of bodies. Caesar was sitting calmly on his golden chair in the rostra, wearing his purple triumphator's robes, his laurel wreath curling around his head. On each end of the platform stood two statues of Caesar, as if they were guarding and duplicating him. I thought of our Egyptian Ba and Ka depictions in tombs, which are supposed to incorporate the different essence is of the soul, and thought how similar it was. A shout arose. The Luperci were on their way, running and prancing. The crowd parted, and wild half-naked men leapt into view, cracking their bloody strips. They darted about nimbly like Pan himself, as if their feet were hooves and their thighs haunches. The women ducked and shrieked, but some bowed their bare shoulders to receive the blows. There was Antony among them, clad only in a goatskin loincloth, his shoulders and torso smeared with blood from the sacrifices and the flayed hides. He glistened all over with sweat, but betrayed no other evidence of exertion. A consul of Rome, I heard the loud whistling pronouncement of disapproval from someone below me. Decimus, Trebonius? Oh, ye gods, muttered someone else. But I thought what a splendor there was about Antony that day, not only in his courage in appearing thus in public, but also in his very physique itself, glowing with health and strength, unashamed like a Greek athlete of long ago. It was something the Romans could not fully comprehend, the glory and beauty of it, and so they murmured and condemned. The world of togas could never respect the Greek exaltation of the human body. Now he was approaching the rostra. Now he detached himself from his fellow Luperci and leapt, with one graceful bound, onto the platform. In his hand was clutched a royal white diadem. Where had he got it? Had Lepidus stationed nearby handed it to him? Caesar, he shouted, I offer unto you this diadem. The people wish you to take it and be their king. His perfect forearms, straight and strong, thrust the diadem towards Caesar. It trembled in the clean air, its whiteness making it shimmer a little. Caesar looked at it as if he were eyeing a snake, something dangerous that was about to strike. Nay, he said, pushing it aside. A loud cheer went up, almost balanced by a loud groan of disappointment. Antony stepped closer to Caesar. Once again, the people offer this, he proclaimed. Again, Caesar put up the palm of his hand and turned it away. This time the cheers were louder and the cries of disappointment softer. Antony held the diadem aloft and brandished it. He turned from one end of the rostra to the other, passing it before the eyes of the crowd. Behold, he said loudly, for the third time we offer this. Do not refuse the wishes of the people. He stepped boldly up to Caesar and attempted to remove the laurel wreath and replace it with the diadem. For an instant, his hand hovered over Caesar's head. Then Caesar stood up. No, he said, seizing Antony's hand, making him release the diadem. A deafening roar of approval went up from the crowd. Caesar waved the diadem. Jupiter alone is the king of the Romans, he said. Pray, take this and crown the statue of Jupiter in his temple on the Capitoline. Wild shouts of approval exploded from the crowd, roaring now with excitement. Caesar took his seat again with deliberate movements. Antony jumped off the rostra and ran toward the steps leading to Jupiter's temple, bounding up them like a mountain cat, waving the diadem. Below me I saw the heads turning among the dignitaries as they whispered to their neighbors. They had witnessed what we had meant them to, had they believed it. Alone that night I received a message from Lepidus saying that from what he had observed, the thing he did not identify it any further had been well received. I hoped he was right, but only over the next few days would the truth unfold. Still later, near midnight, a message from Caesar saying simply, I can do no more, let it be. I folded the letter and tried to imagine what he had meant. Perhaps it was just another way of saying, as he had said long before at the Rubicon, let the dice fly high. The things would have to take their course now. They would be what they must be. Watching it all had drained me. I had not realized how every muscle had strained, how I had almost held my breath throughout, how intensely I had focused my mind, willing every onlooker to believe what I desired them to believe. Now I was wrung out, and in solitude I poured myself a portion of sweet wine. It would dull my racing thoughts, I hoped, and soon I lay down on the straight, hard bed and closed my eyes. Caesar made his announcement about the Parthian campaign to the Senate, and at the same time revealed that he had filled all the political appointments for 3 years in advance. For this year, the consuls were Antony and himself, with himself to be replaced by Dolabella, when he departed for the east. For the next year the consuls were Hirtius and Pansa. For the year after, Decimus and Pansa. The governors and provinces were to be Decimus for Gaul and to be replaced by Pansa and Brutus thereafter. Trebonius would take Asia and Tilius Cimber Bithynia. He meant to leave a smooth-running government behind him. But I wondered whom he meant to employ as his generals. Antony was to be tied down in Rome. Munatius Plancus likewise, and Cassius, a fairly good general in spite of his cowardly record in Parthia, was praetor Peregrinus in Rome now, and could not leave. Surely Caesar did not mean to fight his war with Octavian and Agrippa, those boys. My fears for him mounted, yet I continued making ready to leave Rome. At least in Egypt I would be able to help in a limited fashion. Here I was nothing but a troublesome guest. His news was not well received. People were horrified that he meant to leave without surrendering his absolute control of the government. For 3 years, decisions would have to be suspended. The ordinary business of life would come to a standstill. All power had been invested in Caesar, and now he was removing himself with no provisions for a substitute. When he had been away in Egypt and Africa, the same thing had happened. No one had the authority to act in his name. Everyone had hated the situation, and that was but a taste of what was now looming. The dictator for life had Rome by the neck, strangling her, and was preparing to leave her grasping for air, abandoning her for the east. I saw him not at all. He was furiously busy fending off his critics, trying to make final arrangements for both his appointees and his army. Then a strange rumor began circulating so widely that even my servants heard it in the marketplace. The priests had consulted the Sibylline books of prophecy, the same one that had forbade anyone to restore the king of Egypt with a multitude, and they said no one could conquer Parthia but a king, or he would be annihilated and Rome humbled. If Rome sent Caesar or allowed him to go, it would have to be as a king. The moment had come, the moment they assumed he had been aiming at all along. The rumor said that at last the Senate was going to confer this title. When it met at Pompey's theater for the last time before Parthia on the Ides of March, he was to depart for Parthia 3 days later as a king. The warm winds blew through the garden during the first half of March, gently coaxing the hedges to bloom and the trees to unfurl their tightly rolled, delicate leaves. My preparations for my journey were occupying my thoughts, but not quieting my heart. Parthia, why was he going really? What was driving him there? Egypt's role in this campaign, no matter how much I thought about it, my feeling was still the same as my initial outburst. No, I would not involve Egypt in it. And the gift of his mother's jewelry. How could I adequately express the depths of my feelings about it? I promised myself I would never take it off until he returned from Parthia, as if that would make up for having refused him men and arms. I was confused and longed to see him so that we could have a happy parting. The night before the Senate was to meet, he had planned to come to the villa, but in the late afternoon I received a message that he must dine with Lepidus that night. He would postpone our meeting until the day after, but there were still 3 days left in Rome, and we would have time to say our farewells. The weather changed abruptly by the time the messenger brought me that note, and everyone was scurrying inside. Black-bottomed clouds coalesced, blotting out the sun, and a high wind shrieked through the trees. The shutters, drawn tight, rattled like an old woman's teeth. Roman weather is so changeable, I complained to Charmian, just like Roman opinion. I had almost got used to the severe booming thunderstorms that Jupiter hurled at his chosen city, but I would never like them. And the lightning, everyone had a story to tell about a statue, if not a person that had been struck by it. It's a very nasty night, said Charmian, drawing a wooden shawl about her shoulders. She started as one of the tall lamps. A pretty one with a slender pole and clawed feet for its base was blown over. It rolled, clanking a little way, and then stopped, spilling its oil in a trail. I was sorry Caesar had to venture out at all, but at least Lepidus's house was conveniently near him, not like this villa across the Tiber. What did Caesar think about the rumor? Did he believe it, encourage it, dismiss it? There were so many things I needed to know, but I would not know them this night. I slept almost not at all, for the bright blue lightning flashes and the crashing thunders seemed to invade my very chamber. Perhaps I dreamt because at one point I thought the shutters had blown open, and a tongue of lightning licked at the foot of my bed. In the morning, the ugly aftermath did not dispel. The wake of the storm had left several trees in the garden uprooted and flooded the plants by the ornamental pool. In addition, the Hercules statue had been overturned and his club was broken off, although he stared up at the sky as if he had the situation well in hand. As I walked through the strewn garden, I heard ugly noises coming from across the Tiber. People must be fighting or lamenting the storm's damage to their market stalls. I forced myself to continue with the busy work of packing my clothing with Charmian helping. I had brought so many beautiful gowns, so much jewelry, ornamented sandals, hairpins and diadems and headdresses. And I had worn most of them too, and now each one of them was connected with something in Rome. There was the dress I had worn to Caesar's dinner party, and the triumph gown, and now my riding costume, which I had worn on our gallop through the fields. I can remember exactly how I was smoothing out the material of that gown, running my fingers over the sturdy woven linen, when I heard a commotion downstairs. There were cries and shrieks and then footsteps running lightly up to the door. I looked up and saw a boy I recognized, someone from Caesar's household. He was standing, trembling, panting, and gasping. Then he said those words that struck me down. Murder, murder, Caesar's been murdered, he cried. He flung himself on me, collapsing in my arms, sobbing. Caesar's dead. In my most terrible, dark dreams, I had heard those words. In dreams you cannot even repeat to yourself the next morning, hiding away the horror lest it truly happened, the unthinkable. Charmian was staring, her face white, her hands to her mouth. Caesar was dead. Caesar was dead. No, it was impossible. Caesar could not die. I could not be hearing those words now. Not after all the danger was past. The old war's over. The new one not begun. Here in Rome, with his honors. A strange sort of cold gripped me. It had an urgency of its own, and it sucked me into a place I had never imagined. Unconnected, beyond time, cold, 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 all the familiar gone. No, it could not be true. I heard myself asking, what has happened, and felt myself stroking the boy's hair, comforting him, as if he were my own child. He was wrong. He would explain it away, or if there was anything wrong, Caesar was only injured. How do you know Caesar was murdered? I asked him, as gently as I could. I almost whispered, lest speaking it loudly might make it true. All he did was sob, and I could not stand it any longer, could not give him another instant before refuting the false news. And all the while that awful coldness encasing me, making a stiff sort of shield around me. Tell me I lost control, but it was so crucial that I hear it was not true. And even if it was true, perhaps I could reverse it. Or someone could, yes, someone could. Doctors in Rome, yes. I shook his shoulders, but all he did was cry louder. Tell me what you saw, I cried. Was Caesar assaulted in his house? But the guards would protect him. No, he had dismissed the guards. No, not in his house, the boy snuffled. A silly reassurance came to me. Proof that it was false, founded on the idea that this boy was from the house and this boy didn't see it, and there's nowhere else he would have been attacked. Not at Lepidus's house, and certainly not in the Senate. Did someone try to attack him in the street? I cried. Robbers, but he could have defended himself there. And then, oh, those words. No, he whimpered. They murdered him in the Senate, in front of everyone. They surrounded him and stabbed him to death. There were lots of them. And they covered his face. And then he covered his face and died at the foot of Pompey's statue, the one he just had put back. The statue we had watched being carted up the steps. No, it was a mistake. It was someone else. No one would have, not someone who knew. Who are they? I cried aloud. My voice reaching 100 miles away, I felt. My throat was stripped raw by it, by the anguished howl. A group of senators. I'm not sure. I wasn't inside. Brutus and Cassius were the first ones out of the meeting hall and into the portico where I was waiting, and they ran out all bloody, waving their daggers and shouting about liberty and the republic. And all around them, all the senators were fleeing for their lives, holding up their togas and running. Now there's a big riot in the forum, with the murderers shouting, and Cicero trying to make a speech, and an entire company of gladiators loose and looting. Yes, I had heard the dreadful din of it, even from this far away, but I had not attached any meaning to it. There were always riots in Rome. Oh, all you gods, I think I said. I could not distinguish between what I thought and what I said, because within that in that cold cage, I was held a prisoner, muffled in the shock wrapping me like a cloak. I wanted to beat my way out of it, but I could not move. The mob, the Roman mob, I could hear them so plainly. Now that my ears were opened, would they come for Caesar's son here at the villa? Now that horror took me captive as well, adding fear to the shock and pain. Everyone knows that Caesar's son is here, his only son. And if they hate Caesar, then they also hate his son. Oh, my child, were they even now running toward us, waving their daggers? Are they pursuing? I asked the boy. No, they were all running in the opposite direction. No one stayed behind. But they might remember at any minute. I must protect my son. And Caesar, oh gods and goddesses, where is Caesar? I must go to him. Where is Caesar? What has happened to him? I cried. I could rescue him, save him. He's still lying at the base of the statue. Everyone ran away and left him, and he's alone in the Senate house in a pool of blood. He burst into tremulous tears again. Now there was feeling, pain penetrating the cold cloak, as if they had plunged a knife into me as well. driven it deep inside. So mortal was the wound that pierced me all the way through. It was impossible to have left him like that. Everyone fled. Oh, the shame of it, I wept. To leave him there. Is everyone afraid of the murderers? Will no one even touch their fallen commander, the man that until this morning they called sacrosanct? Is not his body to be honored? I cried. At that the boy had a horrible remembrance. They said that they were going to throw the body of the tyrant into the Tiber. Yes, that's what I heard them yelling when they ran out of the building. I felt sick. It was inhuman, degrading. I hated them with a hatred I did not think it was possible to experience. Never, I said. I knew we must go to him, and we must hurry. And when we got there, perhaps he still lived. If he had been left alone and no one with him, perhaps he had only been unconscious, and we would revive him. When we got there, yes, it would be all right. We will go there this instant and convey him to his home, I said. If anyone attempts to prevent it, they will have to kill me as well. Get some other boys and bring a litter. Now let us go directly to Caesar. No, madam, Charmian grabbed onto my arm and attempted to stay me. It is dangerous. There's a killing mob there, and Caesar's murderers. Caesar's murderers are the most abject of cowards, and men of the utmost dishonor. Think you I will shrink from them? Never. At that moment, my newborn anger was serving to protect me, forming a shield around even the coldness, gripping my heart. Pompey's theater in the campus marshes lay closer to the villa than the forum, and it did not take us long to reach it. The enormous structure with its portico of 100 columns reared up, and I could see that it was deserted. No one was lurking save a gladiator or two with his hands full of stolen goods, and they slunk off furtively. The building was empty and dark. Where? I asked the boy. There were many rooms branching off the portico, and I could never guess which one had been large enough for the Senate. He pointed a shaking finger at the doorway far on the other side and walked with me to it, but drew back at the entrance after he had glanced inside. He is still safe, he said. Strange use of words, I could not help thinking. But now he would be safe. We would make him safe. We would save him. At the back wall of the chamber, I saw the statue first, more than life-size and standing proudly, and at its feet, a blood-stained bundle with feet protruding that looked too small for someone of Caesar's height. At once, the relief. It isn't him. I approached the motionless bundle, holding my breath. There would be someone else there. I knelt down, and with a hand that was shaking so badly, I could barely grasp the cloth of the toga. I lifted it and saw Caesar's face. I screamed when I beheld it and dropped the cloth. His eyes were closed, but he did not look asleep. He looked different than I had ever seen him, and those who say the dead look asleep are liars. Then, after getting control of myself, I lifted the cloth again, reached out my hand and stroked his cheek, cold as if the coldness of the marble floor had crept into him and suffused him while he lay there. I gazed at him, and all of myself seemed to drain away. My inner being melted, and I felt utterly lost, deserted, abandoned. My life was gone, torn from me, not gently extinguished. My love, my friend, I whispered, touching him again. I held absolutely still, but not as still as he. And all the truth rushed in on me, and I knew the purest form of anguish. "Oh, Isis," I wailed, and suddenly the story I had always known about Isis and the death of her husband Osiris, cruelly murdered and then dismembered by his brother, came true. I was Isis, and here lay my Osiris, attacked by those who had called him father of his country and vowed to protect his life with their own. Now I saw the places in his toga. It seemed like hundreds of them that had been ripped by the daggers. He had been set upon as if by a pack of wolves, killed by those sworn to protect him. He had been without any weapon, for it was against the law to have weapons in the Senate. I flung myself across him and embraced him, stiff and bloody as he was. I knew I was smeared with blood, but I did not care. I wanted to stay there with him forever, but at the same time I was suddenly anxious for him to be taken from this abominable place. The boy had come back bringing 2 companions and a sturdy canvas litter. They hung back in the doorway and stared. I finally said, "Come here," and they obeyed, tiptoeing up as if they were afraid Caesar would rise up under the toga. And oh, if only he could. I would have given my own life if he could. "It is time. Convey him to his house. Has Calpurnia been told?" There was that to face as well. The boy nodded. "Very well then, take him to her. I will follow." Gingerly, they managed to pick him up and place him on the litter. They covered his face again so no one on the way could gaze at him, and hoisted the litter up onto their shoulders. I saw they had left one arm hanging over the side. It trailed down, swaying with the motion of the bearers, and the hand was limp. The sight of that hand, now powerless, ripped through me so that I could hardly stand. If only Charmian were here so I could lean against her. But I must not fall. I must not fail that poor arm, now utterly unable to defend itself. And I would avenge him if it took me all the rest of my life. Somehow I would do it, using any weapon or person that came to hand. Ahead of me the arm swayed, the litter bounced. "I am here, Caesar. I will not desert, nor will I leave your enemies unpunished. And what I leave undone, your son Caesarion will finish. This I solemnly swear to you." The boys carried the litter down the steps, the same steps where Antony had bought all the sausages and Caesar had laughed so loudly. The forum was filled with milling mobs, but we managed to make our way through as if we were invisible. There was such confusion. I was walking and called no attention to myself by an ornamented litter, and no one suspected the 3 boys of carrying anything important. Strange how blind and dull a crowd can be, even at its most agitated. Caesar's house loomed just ahead, and the boys knew which side entrance to go into with their precious burden. We entered and quickly bolted the door behind us. The same airy atrium, the same central pool, calmly reflecting the dull gray sky, where Caesar had so elegantly received guests, awaited us. The boys set the litter down, and Calpurnia emerged from the shadows, walking stiffly, leaning on 2 servants. Her face was changed almost as much as Caesar's, puffy and ravaged at the same time. Weeping, she took each halting step toward the litter, her feet dragging. I turned away and sought the other end of the room to allow her privacy. I heard loud screams, cries, stormy weeping, and then a dead silence. At last I turned back around and saw her in a heap beside the litter, its covering sheet drawn back. I went over to her, unsure what to do, but feeling united to her in a terrible way. I bent down and laid my hands on her shaking shoulders. Caesar's face, that face, it was turned toward us. I could not bear it, to see it so changed and ugly still. I pulled the sheet back over it. My dear, I said, and she was dear to me at that moment, as she had been his, and now everything he had ever touched or been connected to in any way was inestimably precious. I know you feel the daggers as if they had struck you themselves. She allowed herself to lean against me a little. Yes, she whispered. I could feel them even as it happened. She turned her face to mine. I dreamed it all last night. I saw it. I felt it. The only difference was that in the dream he collapsed and died in my arms. I saw him alive, not like this. She attempted to lift the cloth again, having a need to see him, but her hand fell back limply. I warned him. I begged him not to go to the Senate. She hunched up on her knees, bending over him. And he had dreamed that he was carried up into the clouds, and Jupiter reached out for him. Oh, it was all so clear. We knew, and yet he went. She slumped back down again, then her voice rose, as she suddenly remembered. He had agreed not to go after all. A soothsayer had warned him about the Ides. Yes, and the hour had passed, and he had not appeared at the Senate. And then Decimus came and begged him to make an appearance. He explained about my dream and the bad omens, for during this storm the shields of Mars fell down off the walls, a terrible warning, and said he would not come. And then it became to come together in her mind. Decimus laughed and said the Senate might change its mind about the honors if he had to announce that Caesar stayed away on account of his wife's dreams. He made it sound so foolish, but I knew what I had seen in my mind. Oh, we never should have yielded. I had a horrible suspicion. Decimus, what was he to you? Why, he was one of Caesar's most trusted friends, she said. And did he escort Caesar to the Senate? I believe so, she said. They set out together, Caesar and his litter. I watched them. There were crowds all about, and someone thrust a scroll into Caesar's hand. But then petitioners do that. The litter, the ceremonial one he wrote in, where is it? I don't know. It's at the theater still, one of the boys said. Bring it, I ordered him. Bring it so we leave nothing of Caesar's for the mob. Perhaps the scroll was still in it. Outside I could hear the noise of the crowd. Observe well who is at large, I told them. Where have the murderers gone? Calpurnia allowed herself to be drawn to her feet. I am afraid they will come and raid this house, she said. There was no one to protect it. Caesar had dismissed his guards. Lepidus had 1 legion in the city, as Caesar's military second in command. What other forces were there? Decimus had his gladiators. Gladiators? What was it the boy had said? An entire company of gladiators, loose and looting. Again I had that sickening lurch of feeling. Decimus's gladiators, why had they happened to be there? Decimus had brought them to Rome and stationed them there. Decimus had brought Caesar to the Senate against his will. Decimus was one of Caesar's most trusted friends. It was a plot, a huge plot. It was not just Brutus and Cassius. It was a widespread, organized body of assassins. For weeks, Caesar had been surrounded by secret enemies. For if they had Decimus, they had other unsuspected partisans. What about Antony? Was he one of them? And Lepidus? Were Calpurnia and I his only loyal adherents? He had eaten with them, laughed with them, planned his Parthian campaign with them, walked through the forum with them, and they had smiled and fawned and voted more honors to him. I remembered the obsequious magistrates meeting him at the temple, all the while planning to kill him. How they must have gloated over that in their secret conclaves, mocking him. The boys returned with the litter, and in it were several rolled-up scrolls, all unread. Most of them indeed contained petitions, but one detailed the entire plot and begged Caesar to save himself. It said the conspiracy encompassed some 70 men. 70. How could they have kept the plot secret? But then they had not kept it secret. Caesar was warned in this scroll, only too late. It said that Cassius wanted to kill Antony as well, but Brutus had argued against it, saying that the sacrifice of Caesar would not be sacrifice, but just plain murder if it took in others. So Trebonius was assigned to detain Antony outside. Antony was loyal. I felt immense relief, but where was he? Where had he fled to? Rising noise outside, I had a ladder brought so I could look out the upper windows without opening the door. I did not know whether to be thankful Caesar's house was right in the midst of the forum or not. A huge mob gathered in a knot near the center of the forum, and I saw a single file of men coming down from the Capitol, holding their hands up and yelling, "Cicero, Cicero." But I did not see anyone who looked like Cicero. I saw Dolabella, a wild, unstable man who was an expert at whipping up crowds, stand on a pedestal to address the crowd. Then Brutus and Cassius. I could not hear anything they said, but I knew how to read crowds, and I could see that the people were not responding. The conspirators turned and went back up the hill to the Capitol. It was growing dark. How sudden. But of course it was not sudden. It was just that time was no longer the normal stretch of minutes, but some other monstrous thing. The sun had kept its journey as if this were any other day. It should have stopped. It should have sent forth sparks. Anything but this peaceful transit across the sky, and now a twilight like any other. There was a loud banging on the door, and as the bolts were pulled away, Antony burst in. He looked around wildly, throwing off the hood of his slave's cloak, his disguise. "Caesar, Caesar, oh my lord, my captain." He rushed to the litter and fell on his knees, yanking off the covering. He threw back his head and let out a long, mournful wail. His fists were clenched, his arms rigid by his side. Then he brought his hands up to his face and wept. Calpurnia and I stood back silently. It was many minutes before his shoulders stopped shaking and he wiped his cheeks and turned and saw us. "Thanks be to all the gods that you are here," said Calpurnia. Antony got up slowly. "And thanks be to all the gods that we are safe," he said, looking around. "And that Caesar is here with us. Now they cannot desecrate him unless they kill us all." "They are probably willing to do so," I said. "What would stay their hands, the hands that swore to protect the very man that they have slain?" "Only their misguided belief that they are high-minded and not ordinary assassins and murderers," he said. "They believe themselves honorable." "Honorable," said Calpurnia. "They believe that it was honorable to kill Caesar and equally honorable to let us live," said Antony. "Well, they shall die for their honor," I said. Anger and sorrow kept fighting within me, and at this moment the anger had its turn. Antony spun around and stared at me. "When?" he said. "As soon as we have forces to oppose them," I said. "The gods themselves will see to the hour and place," said Calpurnia. "No, Caesar and I will," I swore, looking at him. I knew his spirit and mind would range over all the world before we would let his murderers live. "First we must calm Rome," said Antony. "We do not want the city destroyed in senseless riots. The city upon which Caesar has lavished so much care. After the danger is past, we shall pursue the murderers, but all in good time." "We have a lifetime," I said. "I am sole consul," said Antony. "I am now the head of the government, the senior magistrate. I will take control as best I may, but it is tricky. We must disarm the conspirators, both literally and figuratively. I will call a meeting of the Senate for tomorrow." As if everything were normal, I cried. We must pretend to them that we think it is, he said. We must not alarm them, but we must wrest control from them. He turned to Calpurnia. Caesar's will, where is it? With the Vestal Virgins, she said. And what of Caesar's papers and his money? All here, she said. Here, she pointed toward a room opening off the atrium. They must be transferred to my house, said Antony. Tonight, under cover of darkness, they must not fall into the conspirators' possession. And once I have control of them, my hand is strengthened. He turned to me. Return to the villa. Stay there until I send you word it is safe. Do we have any soldiers at our command? I asked. I had my Egyptian guards. I would encircle Caesarion with them tonight. Lepidus is with us, he said. Lepidus. So that question was answered. He will bring his legion onto the campus marshes tonight, to be ready to move into the forum at daybreak and occupy it. We will seize the state treasury as well to prevent the conspirators from having any money at their disposal. He put his arm on my shoulder. Return to the villa now, he said. Return and pray that all goes well in the next 2 days for us. I glanced back at the litter lying so quietly by the pool. No stirring, no change in it. The hand still lay exposed. I went over to it, took it in mine, and kissed it. Farewell and farewell, I whispered. That had been his favorite parting, the words he had used when he left for Spain. I wanted never to leave him, but I could not bear to stay by his still side any longer. I watched from my window all night. How could I rest? Caesar was dead. The entire world was destroyed. Never for one instant did that terrible vision, the sight of him lying there, fade from my mind. It veiled and shrouded everything, the things seen and the things unseen. I stood leaning on my shaking elbows at the window as the stars wheeled in the black sky and slowly faded in the early morning. What would happen to me, to Caesarion, to Rome, to Egypt? I was only 25. What would another 40 years without him hold for me? The universe was empty. He who had blotted out the sky was gone. In the darkest time of the night, when the tumult of the forum began to die away, I wept at last, quietly, because I did not want Caesarion to be disturbed, the poor child, unaware of what he had just lost. I was unable to cry aloud as I needed to, so all the sorrows stayed contained in me. The hot tears did no good. My throat was raw and felt as if it were swelling with the very effort of holding in my cries. My chest was on fire, aching with the unearthly pain that filled it. My sobs were silent heaves that tore at me and seemed to increase my suffering, not assuage it. Caesar was gone, gone, gone. How would I bear it? Sudden death had torn my dearest, most loving protector away from me a second time. The following day had the dull feeling of the aftermath of a natural disaster. There was nothing to do but wait and continue to prepare for my leave-taking. I was drained from my suppressed crying and moved like a sleepwalker now, or a person underwater, as if afraid that any sudden movement would cause me to feel even more pain. The things I had cared about: was this container waterproof? Had I arranged my official correspondence in the correct chronological order so that it could be transferred intact to the archives in Alexandria, so that it could be transferred, were of no moment. And so what was usually so wrenching and time-consuming was soon done. Later, when I unpacked, I had no memory of any of it. Antony faithfully sent messengers telling me of events. Brutus had called another meeting on the Capitol, trying to generate public support and enthusiasm, but he had failed again. The mood was starting to turn ugly. The praetor who had denounced Caesar, was pursued into a nearby house, and the hostile mob would have burned it down if Lepidus's soldiers had not prevented them. Another night in which I did not sleep. How many sleepless nights can a person endure? The stars blazed again and circled the sky and died away. And dawn came up, leaving me lightheaded and exhausted beyond mortal weariness. I held my own private communion with grief all through those hours of darkness, but there was no comfort anywhere, and the second night was worse than the first. Each hour seemed to increase my pain and awareness, not dull or soothe it. More messages. The Senate had met, and the senators had expressed a wide range of reactions. The most extreme had proposed the conspirators be given special honors as public benefactors. So much were the honors of the Senate worth. The less extreme merely said that amnesty should be granted to all, and that Cicero proposed an act of oblivion like the one they had dealt Caesar. Someone else had said Caesar should formally be declared a tyrant and all his acts illegal. Antony had reminded them that if that were done, then every one of them who owed his appointment to Caesar would have to resign it. There would be no praetorship for Brutus and Cassius, no Bithynia for Tullius Cimber, no Asia for Trebonius, no Cisalpine Gaul for Decimus. There should be torture and hell for Decimus at the hands of his own gladiators. The conspirators had tried to prevent the reading of Caesar's will, but Calpurnia's father had refused to be bullied by them, had ordered the vessels to release it, and had announced that Antony would read it from his house. Next, they tried to block a public funeral for Caesar, but Antony pointed out that any consul who had died in office was permitted a public funeral, and Caesar was consul. The whole world would pay homage to him. His enemies who had killed him, now let them see how they would be hated. It grew dark again, and this time I felt sleep coming over me. I knew I would at last rest, or what from now on must serve as rest. But at midnight a messenger arrived with a vehement note from Antony. The will. I read it out to Caesar's friends and family. It is not what I expected. He has named Octavian his principal heir, and requests him to be adopted as his son. He is to assume the name of Gaius Julius Caesar, and Caesar named Decimus as one of his secondary heirs, should his other great nephews die early. Oh, the perfidy of Decimus is now made more hideous than ever. He has given the gardens of the villa, your villa, to the people of Rome, along with 3 gold pieces a person, generous indeed. And when the people hear of it, I cannot vouch for the safety of any of the conspirators, or the liberators, as they now call themselves. I was forced to have Cassius as my house guest tonight in exchange for my own son as a hostage on the Capitol. The food tasted like poison. I asked Cassius if he had a dagger, and he said, "Yes, and a big one, should you try to play the tyrant too." We shall see what awaits him at the hands of the mob. The funeral tomorrow night, I speak the eulogy as his nearest male relative here. There will be a funeral pyre in the Campus Martius, but the beer and ceremony will be in the Forum. Should you wish to attend, you and Calpurnia will be safe on the steps of the Temple of Vesta, where Lepidus will station soldiers. My head whirled. Octavian to be his son, to take his name. But there was already another who bore the name Caesar, Ptolemy Caesar. How could there be more than one Caesar? As if Octavian could ever be Caesar. He was only distantly related, a mere great-nephew. And there was nothing of Caesar about him. His slight frame, his utter lack of athleticism or soldiership or oratory. No, nothing. Whatever had possessed Caesar to name him? And why had he not warned me? Perhaps I had known him very little. How much more there would have been to learn had the gods just granted us time. Drawn as if by a strong wind, I went to the Forum on the night of Caesar's funeral. I arrived well before dark. My litter had taken me past the enormous waiting funeral pyre in the campus marshes beside his daughter Julia's tomb. The logs were neatly arranged and decorated. I shuddered. I hated the whole idea of burning someone. But then the Romans hated our custom of embalming. It was all ugly. There was no redeeming death, no matter which method we chose to consume the body. Calpurnia was already there on the curving steps of the round temple of Vesta. She looked almost pleased to see me, her sister in this strange way, her companion in loss. "They are on their way here," she said. They took him away this morning. Look, see where they will lay him." She pointed to a huge bier made to look like the temple of Venus Genetrix. Under its columns an ivory couch covered with purple and cloth of gold waited to receive him. A low sound filled the air as musicians began to play dirges and solemnly beat their drums around the bier. The people joined in, moaning and swaying. Their torches lit all around the Forum, ringing it with golden light. I could see the procession now making its way toward us. A sigh went up from the people. The decorated litter borne by 10 magistrates wound its way to the waiting bier. Then it was placed reverently on the ivory couch, and the men stepped back. Antony appeared and mounted the bier, resplendent in his consular robes. First a herald recited a ringing tone. All the decrees passed in Caesar's name by the Senate and the people of Rome, including the oath of loyalty they had all sworn. At this, the people gave a groan. Then he recited Caesar's wars and battles. At the enemies defeated and the treasure sent home, the territories added to Rome, the thanksgiving voted to him. Antony then stood beside the bier and began intoning the sonorous funeral chant. The people took it up, moaning and moving back and forth. The chant finished. Antony then began to speak with a loud, resonant voice, an oratory for which he was famed. "Caesar, Caesar," he cried, "will there ever come another like you to Rome? You who so tenderly loved it like a son, cherished it like a wife, and honored it like a mother. No, no, never, never, never." He looked around at the entire crowd, his head held high. For the gods, Caesar was appointed high priest, for us consul, for the soldiers, imperator, and for the enemy, dictator. But why do I enumerate these details when in one phrase you called him father of this country, not to mention the rest of his titles? He turned and gestured towards Caesar lying on the ivory couch. Yet this father, this high priest, this inviolable being, this hero and god is dead, alas. Dead not by the violence of some disease, nor wasted by old age, nor wounded abroad somewhere in war, nor caught up inexplicably by some supernatural force, but no, he who held an army into Britain died right here within the walls of the city as a result of a plot. His voice rising, his right arm in an arc, indicating everyone before him. The man who enlarged its boundaries, ambushed in the city itself. The man who built Rome a new Senate house, murdered in it. The brave warrior, unarmed. The promoter of peace, defenseless. The judge beside the court of justice. The magistrate beside the seat of judgment. He whom none of the enemy was able to kill, even when he fell into the sea at the hands of the citizens. He who so often took pity on his comrades at their hands. He turned back to Caesar again and cried out to him, "Of what avail, Caesar, was your humanity? Of what avail your inviolability? Of what avail the laws? Now, though you enacted many laws that men might not be killed by their personal foes, yet how mercilessly you yourself were slain by your friends. And now the victim of assassination, you lie dead in the forum through which you often led the triumph crowned. Wounded to death, you have been cast down upon the rostra from which you often address the people. Woe for your blood-bespattered head! Alas for the rent robe which you assumed! It seems only that you might be slain in it." His voice broke and tears streamed down his face. Just then someone near the bier shouted the line from a well-known play by Pacuvius, "What did I save these men that they might slay me?" And it sounded as if the voice were coming from Caesar himself. Suddenly Antony snatched up Caesar's bloody toga and held it aloft in his spear, twirling it around. The torchlight showed the stains turned black now, and the gaping holes in the garment. "Look there, see how he was brutally slain? He who loved Rome so that he has left his gardens to you as well as bequests of money. This was his reward for loving you, the people of Rome." He waved the toga like a battle flag, and a great cry arose from the crowd. They rushed forward in a shouting mass, yelling about Caesar. Suddenly, as if by magic, they were hauling furniture toward the bier. Benches, stalls, chairs, staves, and turning it into a funeral pyre. Here in the forum," they screamed, piling up the furniture. Antony hastily jumped down off the platform just as the first torch cartwheeled through the air and landed on the pile. It flickered and caught, and then a rain of other torches followed. People rushed toward the roaring fire as it reached up toward Caesar. "Caesar," my heart stood still as I saw the flames licking up around his couch and he lying motionless on it. They tore off their clothing and heaved it into the flames. The official mourners who had worn his four triumphal robes tore them to pieces and cast them into the fire. Soldiers ripped off their valuable breastplates and threw them in, and women flung in their jewelry as if they were all sacrificing at some primitive bonfire to the god Caesar. Thus the people proclaimed him a god long before Octavian did. People fell on the ground sobbing, beating their breasts, wailing. The smoke rolled in billowing clouds, blocking out the stars. Sparks flew upward in the darkness, each a new star, flaming and dying. A group of people, differently dressed, stood by the flames, swaying and chanting. I learned later that these were Jews who knew Caesar as their partisan and friend. He had obtained many privileges for them, and they were to mourn by the ashes of the funeral pyre for days afterward. We watched, transfixed, as the great sacrifice was consumed in the night. The gods accepted it, and I relinquished Caesar into their pitiless hands. Day followed day in the splendor of high summer, and I gradually mastered all the accounts, ledgers, and reports that had accumulated awaiting my return. It was the Egyptian month of Apiph and the month of Quintilis, now officially called Julius in the Roman calendar. From what my informers told me, for by this time I had established a few listening posts in Rome, Brutus was incensed. He was especially infuriated because while he himself had to stay away from Rome for his own safety, the Ludi Apollinaris games that he, as praetor, was required to sponsor were going to take place right in the middle of this newly named month. The honors would accrue to Caesar, but the cost would be borne by Brutus. Then I heard that Octavian, as if to snub Brutus' efforts, was holding games right afterward to celebrate Caesar's victories, the Ludi Victoriae Caesarius, and he was doing it at his own expense to show his father's love for his people. He was also demonstrating his own loyalty, since the officials in charge of putting them on were too cowardly to dare. But before any reports came to me about either set of games, I had yet another misfortune. I lost the child I was carrying, the last legacy from Caesar. In its particulars, it was like the birth of Caesarion, only the birth was too small to live. It was only halfway to its time of normal birth. I was forced to lie abed, dosed with pennyroyal and draughts of red wine. It was not my body that needed cosseting, however, but my spirits. Farewell and farewell, I thought, holding tightly to the pendant around my neck. Now there will never be a new thing between us. Our life together is frozen in the past. Gone, gone, and gone, I repeated to myself, lying on the bed, and each word was like a hammer on my soul. Gone forever. Everyone was very kind, hovering around me. Charmian and Iris anticipated my every wish. Mardian came with jokes and riddles. Ptolemy wrote some stories that he insisted on reading to me, and Epaphroditus had some of his scriptures copied out for me. They all dealt with loss and fortitude. I particularly liked one that went, "Thus saith the Lord." A voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel, weeping for her children, refused to be comforted. For her children, for they were not. For they were not. Sad words, sad thought, true thought. The nights were hot, my chamber stifling. They moved my bed out onto the terrace, where the sea breezes blew and I could see the stars. I would lie and look up at the blue-black bowl that arched over me, thinking of the Egyptian belief that each night the goddess Nut, stretched across the sky from east to west, swallowed the sun which traversed her body to be reborn each dawn. She was always depicted in gold, lying across a deep, rich blue sky. It was artistic fancy. The stars were not gold, they were a cold, fiery white. And the sky was inky. In the nights I lay outside, the moon was dark and as well. Then the anticipated rising of Sirius, the star that had been below the horizon for 70 days, took place, a brilliant spot of light. It signaled the first day of the new year and announced that far away to the south the Nile too would begin to rise. The year was cycling, moving relentlessly on. I could hear far below me and outside the palace grounds the shouts of excitement as Sirius was sighted, and the noisy celebrations began. Even to the Alexandrians, the rising of the Nile was life-bringing, as it was necessary to produce the grain the city exported. How bright the light of the lighthouse was tonight. They must have stoked it up with extra fuel. How long a trail the flames were making. Then I suddenly saw that it was not the Pharos at all, but something else behind it, something in the sky. I flung off my light coverlet and went to the edge of the roof, changing my angle of vision. Yes, it was a brilliant light hanging all by itself in the sky, low, so that it was almost even with the top of the Pharos, but it was not a star. It had a long trail. A comet. There was a comet in the sky. I had never seen a comet, but I somehow knew that was what it was. It was beautiful, unique. The trail trailed off in little twinkles that looked like glowing sparks. The head hovered protectively like a hood of a divine cobra. At once a strange sensation passed through me, a jolt of recognition. It was Caesar, taking his place in the heavens among the gods, and also at this very time rising to show me that he would never leave me, would always be with his true wife and fellow divinity, and take my part from heaven. He would not suffer our son to be kept from his inheritance. He would fight for it with me, more powerful now in the heavens than ever he was on earth, where he was hemmed in by little men and his own mortality. I heard his voice in my ear, softer even than a whisper, or was it merely inside my own head, saying that all would be well, but I must stop this morning. I must rise from the sickbed and be the Cleopatra he admired for her strength and ingenuity. That was the true Cleopatra, the queen of Egypt and wife of Caesar, not this weak creature, weeping and lamenting and languishing. You must bear your losses like a soldier, the voice told me, bravely and without complaint, and just when the day seems lost, grab your shield for another stand, another thrust forward. That is the juncture that separates heroes from the merely strong. The comet blazed, commanding my attention, saying, "Take heed." And I said, "Yes, I do," and felt joy for the first time since his death, or rather as I knew it now to be his departure. I lay back down and watched the comet, closing my eyes and letting it hang over me all night. Far away in Rome, unknown to me at the time, Octavian also saw the comet, which appeared just as he was holding his Caesarean games between July 20th and 30th. It caused a sensation among the populace, who also interpreted it as I had. They knew it was Caesar being accepted into the panoply of gods. Octavian at once denounced his father's divinity and affixed the supernatural star to the brow of Caesar's statues and declared that henceforth all coins would depict Caesar wearing his celestial star. And also unknown to me at this time, Octavian took the comet to be a summons to himself, announcing his destiny and calling on him never to rest until he had avenged Caesar's murder. Both of us called to arms by Caesar that night, both of us wishing to avenge him and complete his work, both of us needing to destroy the other to do so. Caesar had 2 sons, but there could be only one heir. Caesar had a vision of his future world empire, but was it to be centered in Rome or Alexandria? Would it be Western or Eastern in location and spirit, and who would preside over it? The astrologers were abuzz with excitement about the comet, which remained in the sky for many days, and held nightly gatherings in the Museion to study it. From as far away as Parthia, astronomers and astrologers came. They were honored with the title Magi, or wise men, to meet with their fellow scholars. Once again, Alexandria was the center of intellectual excitement, and I took great pride in that. I met with them myself one evening, asking them to draw up some astrological charts for Caesarion and Ptolemy and me. They were gathered in the circular marble hall of the building in its very center. Most of them wore Greek dress, but the foreigners wore their long embroidered robes, and 2 Egyptians from Upper Egypt wore the ancient costume of the Nile. "Gentlemen, I am surprised that you are not outside studying the comet in the heavens directly," I told them. Rolls of charts were spread out on the folding tables along with mathematical books. "Some of us are," said Hephaestion, our leading astronomer. "The viewing platform on the roof is very crowded. The rest of us are working on the charts down here, amending them." "Had you predicted this comet?" I asked. "No," he admitted. "No, it was a complete surprise. That strengthened the proof that this was no ordinary comet, but a supernatural appearance. What is your conclusion about it?" "It is miraculous," he said. "It must portend some event of great importance. The birth of a child, perhaps, who will fulfill one of the many prophecies." No, that was not it. Caesarion had already been born, and the next baby lost. Even Octavian, should he fancy the comet was for him, was already 18. Could it be interpreted by him erroneously? Of course, as a marking his taking Caesar's place in Rome. No, that cannot be, I said impatiently. More likely it announces the world upheaval that started with Caesar's death. He nodded in assent just to be polite. I looked over at all the scholars poring over their charts and arguing. Can you deliver these horoscopes to the palace within 3 days? I asked, presenting him with the data. I was most anxious to peek behind the workings of fate and see what was ahead. Again, he bowed politely. When the horoscopes were duly presented, I discovered that even though the astrologers had used the most ambiguous and soothing language, the stars were not kind to Ptolemy. As for Caesarion and myself, our destinies were intertwined, taking strength from each other. The fulsome prediction for me was that I would die as I wished and live eternally. The words shimmered, and did it mean die as I would like to die in the manner in which I would like to, or did it mean die because I would wish to? Astrologers. But as for Ptolemy, I saw now that I would have to take him to Upper Egypt for winter if he had any hopes of recovery.